I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Michael Jansen, Chief Research Officer, guides the practice's research agenda and architecture by leveraging his extensive experience to identify and unlock emerging trends. Jimit Arora, Partner, leads Everest Group's research offerings focused on enterprise executives in IT, sourcing, and vendor management and shared services. Ashwin, Vice President, leads Everest Group's research offerings focused on cloud and infrastructure services. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Michael. Take it away, Michael.
All right, thank you, and welcome everybody. I'm calling in from Dallas, Texas here. It's frigid here, I have to say. It's almost like feeling like this December, January weather. I'm not sure if that's just the actual temperature in the thermometer or it's all of us holding our breaths to see the results of our election that's coming up that I'm sure is of interest for all US participants, but also probably a global perspective as well. So thinking about the topic for today, having been in the industry for 3+ decades, I grew up in a world that looked at the IT infrastructure and the IT applications. Those were the skills that, kind of people gravitated to infrastructure applications. But over time, we continue to talk about, the business context, savings, and value. And that's not a new change, or that's not a new conversation for us. But what we wanted to talk about today, and I'm going to turn this over to Jimit here, how do we think about the operating model coming into play more than just the component pieces?
Yeah, hey Michael, thank you. And up in New York, it isn't as freezing as where you are, but it's still rainy and gloomy. But hey, on to sunnier topics, and let's kind of talk through the changes that we're seeing in the future IT operating model. And in some ways, I'm kind of reminded of the book Built to Last by Jim Collins, where the whole concept of here's the tyranny of the or, which is what you see IT has been plagued with for a long period of time. It's been always about the trade-offs you make. Do you get savings or do you get value, right? So it was always about the or function and the trade-offs. What we're really seeing happen in some of the more sophisticated organizations right now as they're designing the future-ready operating model is that they can embrace the genius of the and. And as you think about it, we are getting experience, which has become one of the biggest objective functions in IT. So be it user experience or customer experience, we are getting it at speed, at high quality, and we are driving all of these initiatives while achieving savings. So I think from a mindset perspective, one of the things we really need to embrace as we are designing these future models is to move from the tyranny of the or to the genius of the and. And Michael, that's why I think this is really so exciting.
Yeah, I like to see that experience on there, because if I go back to the key issues that we were input we got from our clients about what they were concerned about going into 2020, it was both the customer experience and the employee experience. That was the top of the list for the issues, and so seeing that on here is really good. So let's talk about the discussion points, the agenda for today. So we're going to talk about the operating model. We're going to talk about how the design attributes that we think are important as we go forward, and then we're going to bring that model to life, and then we're going to answer your questions and answers. So before that, we are a data-driven firm, and we thought we'd always start with a conversation about you and hear what you have to say with regards to what you think the most critical challenge for your organization is in driving IT function and driving greater business value. So we're going to open up a poll here, and you can select. You can choose more than one if you want. Lack of budget, lack of talent, silos of excellence, inability to measure value delivered, and lack of high performance culture. So go ahead and get your vote in here. We got about 20% right now. No clear winner yet. Okay, we'll give it another 5 seconds here. Well, Jimit, you're going to like this. There is almost no winner here. There kind of a little pull ahead at the very end there. All right, so The most critical challenge here: silos of excellence and innovation. Yeah, I've seen that in the outsourcing world for a long time. Lack of innovation is a challenge, and so not surprising there. Jimit, any other reactions from you?
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting if you look at the first two, right? And this is where we say, hey, when you're thinking of technology, people gravitate towards the quantitative or tangible issues, right? Whereas a lot of what we are seeing right now is a lot of changes in the org model, which is the silos that you're talking about, inability to measure value, right? Which is again an intangible in some ways. And we see those are the issues that are getting amplified. And the good news is that I hope to be able to touch upon a majority of these as we progress through our discussion.
Okay, so let's move on to our chapters here. Why now? Why now is this important? I'm going to turn that over to Ashwin. Ashwin, are you?
Thanks, Michael. Yes, I'm here, Michael. Thank you so much. So why now, right? So just to answer this question, and as we can see, we have what seem to be some alarming numbers in terms of how we see digital transformation initiatives fail as of today. And I'd like to start by stating that the key driver here for all of this is eventually the complexity and the pace of evolution of the IT environment in itself, right? So there's so many technologies, it's a proliferating landscape. There are so many moving parts and components, and ultimately it's the ability or the inability of the IT function to deal with this complexity that determines the success and failure of all of these initiatives. If you look at the data that we have here, right, and we pick a couple of examples very quickly. So for instance, if we look at the first data point, the entire cost saving aspect. So now there are a number of different levers that can be pulled by enterprises today. You can do automation, you can right size your pyramid, you can think about cloud and the way you consume it, right? So there are many different ways. And yet what we have seen is there are certain enterprises where the basic requirement of having a granular visibility into the cost components itself is missing, right? So you don't have the base, and then when you start with transformation initiatives, you do not know what you're measuring, and eventually the bill gets bloated up. You don't have visibility into new cost components that come in, and it becomes a failure, right? Let's take another example. We're saying that 2/3 of the people, enterprises lack the right skills. So if you really think about it, in the IT world, the number of programming languages and the versions are just increasing day on day. And yet, during the pandemic, mainframe came into the scheme of things, and we had some enterprises scrambling for the good old COBOL skills, right? So, and then as we saw in the poll as well, there's no silver bullet answer here. It's a complexity that requires a lot of variables that need to be played around with. And but the good news over here is that there are enterprises who have been successful with their initiatives as well, right? And there are lessons to be learned. And the first step is to understand where the challenges are. And in our experience, as we looked at some of the top challenges that inhibit success within digital transformation initiatives, we could see three broad buckets where the top themes lie. On the left-hand side is what we see as the operations design, where it's about technology and processes. And no surprises, even what we saw in the poll, the biggest challenge, the biggest common denominator that we have seen has been the lack of unification, orchestration, different IT teams working in silos, and none of this coming together to drive straight through value for businesses, right? Another key aspect that we also see is, a strong rigidity in the funding mechanisms that are there, especially in a world of Agile where the goalposts are moving. We don't see enterprises reacting fast enough, right? And all of this is also driven by bureaucracy and a lack of a performance generative culture. So that's on the operations side. If you start thinking about people, the second bucket in between, we see many enterprises still being in a reactive and a here and now kind of a mindset when it comes to their overall workforce planning for IT, right? So there's no baselining of the skills that are required in the future. What are some of the best fit models, whether you need to buy it, whether you need to build talent. All of these tenets are not really being thought through, right? That becomes the second big impediment in our view. And then there's the metrics part of it as well. It's about the choice of the right metrics, but also how do you govern, right? It's about a mix of metrics around cost, around speed, around value, and all the and functions that Jim talked about. And then finally, the other biggest head would be outsourcing portfolios. We again see two ends of the spectrum over here. There are cases where enterprises are leaving a lot of waste in their outsourcing portfolios just because the rate cards are not simply rationalized enough. There are too many vendors in the portfolio. So there's one side where there's a lot of wastage. And then there's the other side of the spectrum where the cost lever is being pulled to such an extent that service providers are not incentivized anymore to drive the innovation charter. They're stifled by the engagement constructs that are put in place. And if you really look at it, all of these challenges have only intensified because of COVID. Enterprise IT is under more pressure for costs, while business wants more agility. And that's the reason, Michael, right now is the time when enterprises start to seriously rethink their IT operating models.
You know, Ashwin, I want to go back one slide here for just a second. We kind of glossed over the statement at the bottom there, the 78% of digital transformation on the previous page.
Yep.
That's a pretty big indictment. When I see numbers, and if I look at all these metrics on here, why is that? What is it? Are we failing across the board, or is it failing in segments? Tell me more what you see there.
So, as I said earlier, right? So, Michael, the reason is that there's no single bullet answer to this, and there are so many operating model dimensions and constraints that need to be taught together, right? In certain cases, the talent could be the limiting factor. In certain cases, the culture could be the limiting factor. And in certain cases, just the choice of the technology, right? So there's no single answer here. But the positive message here is, one, we are not saying that all of these 78% initiatives have failed to take off. There are certain cases where they're not taken off, but in certain cases, it's just that they've been successful partially, right? And then there's this 22% from where we can learn a lot. So yes, it is not a dire situation, but then it's something that needs to be addressed right away.
Yeah, it's a fascinating statistic. I think I'd be really nervous about my boss seeing that chart there. All right, so let's move on to the design attributes and benefits here. And Jimit, you're going to talk about the operating model. And I've always been fascinated by operating models and how they evolve over time. Give us your perspective on what we think should look like going forward for IT.
Yeah, so you know, I think I want to provide a bit of context, right? And Ashwin kind of mentioned some of that when you asked him the question, why is it so gloomy? And there isn't a single answer, right? I think it all comes down to again, I'll step back and I'll digress here. 42, for those of you who know the number, right, is the answer to life, universe, and everything. The same author who gave us 42 also gave us Dirk Gently, who ran the Holistic Detective Agency, right? And what the thesis of how he really solved crimes and solved cases was thinking about the interconnectedness of it all, right? And I think when we've thought about operating models in the past, the primary vehicle has been, hey, let's think of three things. There's people, there's process, and technology. One of the biggest things we found is that simplistic framework of people, process, technology does not lend itself to handle the complexity of what we have in the operating models for the future, right? So the thing that we recommend is to look at it across two broad dimensions that break into 8 components, and you'll find people, process, technology embedded in here, but you need more than that, right? So on the left-hand side, as you're thinking of that IT operating model for digital transformation success, you need elements of strategy, wherein you need to start with the vision. Who is it that you want to be? What's your North Star? What's the economics that align with the vision? How do you design the organization and culture to enable that? And then what are the measures of success through performance management and governance? So we think most operating models, by the way, are focused on the right side, which is the technology, talent, sourcing process. So people, process, technology exist. That we call is the solution model. However, where people struggle is to have that right strategic intent and that clarity of the elements on the left, which, by the way, we think are the areas which drive the most change. And Michael, if you think back to the poll and if you think of items 1, 2, and 3, they were all related to items on the strategy side, right? So one big takeaway that we want people to remember, you need to be holistic. You need to embrace the interconnectedness of the universe. Thank you, Douglas Adams. Some of you will reference and understand the reference in the audience. My marketing team sending me nasty grams for doing this, but hey, it's fun. But you have to take both of these elements in conjunction. So what does that mean? If I unpack this and talk about, so what does good look like on the next slide from an element of strategy perspective, right? From strategy, what we are seeing people align, we've done this across a variety of organizations, right? On the vision side, people are taking more of a customer first and experience first approach to IT, right? So that's one of the most common themes you'd see. Organization and culture, the #1 issue that we saw in the poll was organizational silos. And there's multiple models that you see, but the overarching thesis in the landscape is to move towards more centralized governance structures. And oh, by the way, you're also trying to have a broader purpose. As you think about culture, you're trying to create a high performance generative team, right? So that's what we're seeing on the org and culture side. The approach to outcomes is truly embracing the and function, which is you are reducing costs, but at the same time, you're reinvesting in the areas that matter to win. So it's not just, hey, IT is all about cost reduction and running efficiently. It is reducing the cost, but reinvesting to win. Performance metrics, which was issue #2. Hey, we don't really see the value in the poll, no surprise. And I think this is where traditional service management, which was all about running IT operations, needs to move to a more holistic view of how you think about comprehensive business IT KPIs, as well as the pivot from service levels to experience levels. That's the XLAs. Earlier this year, we ran a webinar where we were speaking of experience levels in workplace. Now we're also seeing experience levels in application maintenance, application development. So the whole thesis is becoming broader. On the solution side, as we think about the dimensions, there's again some very interesting changes that have happened. So the thesis on talent is moving more towards build versus buy, especially around things related to applications development, new technology. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to control your technology destiny, right? As you think of operations, the companies need to embrace new ways of working. You need to think about end-to-end approaches, DevSecOps, scaled agile framework, all of which allows you towards digital experimentation. On the technology side, and this, by the way, we think is the easier part of the transformation success, it's really having the right change management practices which allow you to weaponize technology to transform the business results. And then finally, when it comes to the sourcing and ecosystem, we're seeing a lot of change here, but the thesis here is to drive more simplification in how you run that ecosystem and how you really effectively govern it, right? So again, we're trying to take something which is really complex and distill it down into a few nuggets. What we're going to be doing as we go along is take the elements of the operating model and examine how it plays out in 2 IT towers, applications and workplace shortly.
So Jamil, I think this is really where the and comes in, right? I mean, you're not saying that we have to abandon the old world. It really becomes an additional conversation of being able to take infrastructure skills, application skills, and then add the business context. What does that result in terms of value?
Yeah, no, I think Michael's spot on. So this is all about the end, right? And you can see the interconnectedness of it all as we brought all this together. And I was just reflecting back on some of the work we've done with clients and what this is resulted, right? So as companies have progressed on this journey and started from the initial state, moved forward, we're seeing a greater than 30% cost takeout, which happens over 2 to 3 years. In some cases, it's higher. That, by the way, is the funding mechanism to drive the investments that are needed. So your productivity, which enables a lot of the speed and value, moved from the low left to industry best in class. And essentially, they were able to take a set of metrics where business value could not be correlated to IT results, to where they now have really tangible mechanisms where the business impact of IT is measurable, communicated, and the CIOs on the board, right? So we've seen at least in some of our clients a very successful set of results. I'd say they're probably in the 26% who haven't really seen those big failures on the digital transformation side.
So Jimmy, we've seen over the last decade plus a lot of savings have been attributed to labor arbitrage. Mostly moving things to India in a low cost labor market. This is really going to force organizations to up their game.
Oh yeah, I mean, think of this as the next step change in a lot of ways, right? So labor arbitrage still gives you pretty significant savings. It's not going away. I think there's also a very genuine access to talent issue, right? But all of these elements around automation, we're going to talk later about how managed services can enable some really dynamic results. It creates a next level of savings, which is what people have been craving for, because the incremental on the arbitrage has been tapped out for a while.
Yeah, I mean, there's still some savings there, as you said, but it's not the big value going forward here. So let's move into our next chapter, bringing this model to life. And in this chapter, what we're going to be doing is how do you adapt your models for this? So we're going to look at we're going to spend a lot of time on talent, and so let's Ashwin, tell me what you're thinking about in terms of the overriding principles, and then let's move into the talent conversation, because I think the talent one is going to be especially fascinating.
Sure, Michael. And one of the nicest things about this particular operating model, and we have applied this in many situations, is that while we've been articulating about this model for the overall IT environment, it very nicely applies to the context of individual IT TARs as well, right? And what we have seen is, as we start applying some of these principles, there are an overarching set of core principles that are a common denominator for any TAR that you think of, right? So there are no guesses, no surprises that we are going into a cloud-first world. In fact, the conversations that we were having in the first 2 to 3 months of the COVID disruption primarily involved a lot of enterprises telling that the one thing they would have liked to have done differently in the past is move more workloads to the cloud, right? It was not just about cost, it was not just about efficiency, but it was also about business continuity, right? So cloud first is a given. So when you think of designing any TAR, you want to design it in a way such that, be it applications, be it data, be it whatever aspect of IT, it takes into account that it's going to be a distributed environment of on-premise and cloud. Cloud first also indicates the fact that you use cloud to drive agility within each of these TARs. So whether you can leverage SaaS, leverage cloud-based models to provide agility in the tower stacks as well, right? So that's one common principle. Automation has been interesting. So we have been encouraged by the fact that enterprises do not see automation as a tool game anymore, but it's being genuinely used to drive impact in terms of processes, impact in terms of making the process more agile across each of these TARs. And the common denominator again here, right? As we think of designing, whether it's a workplace, you want to drive analytics and automation to drive experience. If you think of networks, you want to drive more automation because you want the entire environment to be intent-based and then work in the context of that particular application that's being supported, right? So hyper-automation is a common theme. And the third equally important aspect is you want the consumption of the TAR elements to be an as-a-service model so that it is scalable, so that it is cost-effective. And in some ways, you're also leaving the entire platform to be adaptable enough to bring in the elements which can be bought from the external world, and you're able to build some of the internal tooling yourself as well. So we're talking about composable platforms which provides interoperability between tools that are built internally and externally. And we are talking about the platforms being scalable and all of these components being integrated in a seamless manner. So some of the operating principles that are common. When you go to the tower specific principles, ultimately there are two key messages over here. One, you want to ensure that the services delivered by any tower is ultimately rooted in the context of the business. So if you think of workplace, we are talking about designing services, designing technologies that address the specific needs of individual user personas. If you're thinking about networks, what does the underlying network mean for the particular application that we're talking about? If you think of data and analytics again, we talk a lot about self-service and bringing data to the users. So how do you enable some of that? So the context becomes important. And at the same time, you leverage analytics, you leverage automation, you leverage cloud-based delivery to make the tower more, it's all about driving scalability and agility in terms of the way the delivery happens. Now, what we are observing is that there are quite a few technologies that are out there to answer each and every requirement that enterprise IT has. But the key stumbling block becomes the talent angle of things. And Jimit, this is where we have been researching quite a bit on what the future of talent really looks like. So I'll pass this on to you to take our audience through the framework that we have.
Sure, yeah, and it is, if I reflect back on most of the conversations we're having now, it's interesting for most CIOs. I mentioned this earlier. The technology part is actually getting easy. It's the people part, it's the culture part, it's the organization part, it's the skills part that really needs to evolve. And in some ways, what we're seeing is that the requirements of the business, the objective functions are changing. And we've kind of looked at this across three horizons. So what we saw pre-2010, 2010 to 2020, and then what we expect to see going forward. And again, there's no real magic to these numbers, right? We just like to think in terms of round, clean numbers, which is why you see 2010, 2020. But this is a continuum, and obviously it's not as stark as the gray, blue, and orange suggests. But from a technical skills perspective, if you look at the continuum, your talent base needed a single threaded skill profile, which now has kind of moved more towards how you have multifunctional skills. We think about the full stack engineer, the SDETs. So how do you really do that, right? We always de-emphasized, or we didn't really emphasize the non-technical part, right? We valued STEM, but now what we're seeing is this pivot from STEM to STEAM, right? A being the arts within the STEM, and go back to the experience comment we made. That's where the non-technical skills become really important if you're really designing a solution for the user versus designing a solution for engineers. The mandate in a lot of ways has shifted from just doing the operations to ensuring that there's ongoing operations transformation and innovation. The skilling model is no longer, hey, let's have a cube farm, let's have a factory-based approach, but it's more contextual. You're encouraging experimentation and innovation. And then finally, the org structure, the number one issue which kind of came back and said, hey, we don't see the ability to collapse silos, we don't see business value. How people are breaking that is by constructing business aligned or experience aligned pods, where you have business analysts, representatives, as well as the technology team sitting in a self-contained unit to drive progress. So if you really want to think of one of the biggest enablers, the talent, how you configure it has to really change. Excuse me. And then what's also important as we move to the next slide is issues around what are the skills you might need, right? And Michael, I know you wanted to make sure we clarify this every time we talk about this. It's not that all you're going to need is things on the right hand side. This is each element on the left is a stepping stone and the foundation to what we need in the future. So yes, you're still going to need software developers, testers, SAP architects, etc., across a variety of the domains. But you're also going to need capabilities in terms of where we see most of the skills demand today, which is in the middle column. And it's all about the and you now also need to start investing in for the future to make sure that you're getting the 5G systems engineers, the AR, VR developers, and recognize this. You might not have big demand today, but if you're trying to succeed in this journey, you're investing for the future. So what we wanted to provide was a bit of the view of what are some of the skills you need to start investing in now so that the business can see value when they're ready to go mainstream.
Yeah, and I think, you know, if you think about this of yesteryear, it was kind of you build an analyst or programmer from a junior programmer to a senior programmer, and that was kind of the skills life cycle that you would work through. You need to do that very quickly now. You still need, you know, on the back with the previous page, you talked about you know, kind of having a factory of skill building. You still need that, but you still got, it's the and conversation. You got to move through, you know, the first column, the second column, and then the third column very, very quickly to create context. But you know, it's you can't skip that elementary layer of still understanding. Somebody's got to write the code. Somebody's got to still program the machines, but you just have to bring it in a much more higher order levels of business context. And so I think that's going to be the real challenge is for especially in the outsourcing industry is can you develop the skills on the right side quickly enough to be relevant for the business context of today. And I think that's going to be a real challenge. So with that, you know, one of the things that we always like to do is we like to brag about our data. We like to brag about the content we have. And so what we wanted to do is give you the best way we can showcase that is to offer a slice of our data for free. And so this is for enterprises only, but what we're offering here is some of those skills that were in the right-hand side of the previous page. We wanted to give you more insights on those roles. And so we're offering an opportunity here to pick two of the left, and then we're going to provide to you free of charge detailed role descriptions, the passport, skills passport for the role, and a skilling journey that we think represents the future of what we're talking about here. So Amanda, if you could open up the quick poll, if you're interested in one of these, what we'll do is we'll send you a link so you can pick the ones you want, and then we'll get those, get a session set up so we can go through those with you. Just real quick, if you're interested, let us know. If you got everything you need, just say no, and I'll leave it for another 5 seconds here. All right, so we'll be in touch and we'll make sure we get those to use those for those that have asked for it. Okay, so let's move into the future ready IT operations and applications, and we'll take it from here. And that's you, Jamit, again.
Yeah, no, Michael, you gave me most of the content today. But hey, I like the sound of my own voice, so can't complain. So let's move to the next page, and this is where, you know, we wanted to bring this framework to life, because I'm sure everyone's seen a lot of such frameworks, a lot of such charts. And what we wanted to do here was to think through how, in the context of IT applications, you apply the principles of strategy and solution to really get the breakthrough results that we were speaking about, right? So there's a lot to unpack, so I'll dive straight into it. But if we look at the IT applications estate, there's 3 broad themes that we've seen really become successful as companies have applied this principle. Theme 1 is that you optimize your AMS efforts, the maintenance, the run operations. I saw a question earlier, hey, what's really driving that 30% cost takeout? So for example, in the applications estate, it's the ability to decompose the run environment into a very efficient, super automated regime, potentially using a managed service environment, which allows you to save actually upwards of 50% on your run costs, which then starts to create the budgets for your build initiatives, right? The second thesis that we're seeing pretty significantly, there was a lot of religious debate about Agile, and can Agile be done in a distributed environment? Yours truly was on the side of the debate that felt, well, not really. COVID proved us wrong. And now what we're seeing is that there's scaled distributed Agile that's happening, which is allowing companies to also use labor arbitrage more effectively, allowing more savings to do more. So that's another thesis that this has allowed us to do. And then the third, as you think about from a sourcing and ecosystem standpoint, is there's more accountability and responsibility passed to the service providers using managed services constructs. So I'll try to unpack these quickly as we move along. So first off, and thinking about this from a perspective of, okay, so what's really happening to IT budgets? Where is this saving coming from, right? And fundamentally, if we look across the IT estate, here's the reality. Most companies track IT cost as a percentage of revenue, right? Don't expect to get more money for IT budgets next year. Our outlook for this is it's going to stay stable. So the percentage as revenue is going to stay stable. If your company is going to shrink, prepare for your IT budgets to shrink. What's really happening is a rebalance of spend. And on the left-hand side are the items where we are seeing people trying to influence the ratios upwards. So people are trying to spend more on application services. People are trying to spend more on applications development. And people are trying to spend more on creating a digital core, which is to have more infra modernized versus a percentage of the IT infra cost. So the elements on the left are the items where people are trying to influence the ratios upwards. But how do you keep this balanced? And that's where you see a lot of the decreases happening in terms of consumption on the infrastructure side. So in my thesis of spend more on applications, less on infra, cloud becomes a big leverage point there. I talked about, hey, spend more on AD, you try to spend less on AMS, right? So the ratio classically was 60% AMS, 40% AD. The more progressive organizations are flipping that, right? So I think we're seeing that. And then the infra run costs continuing to drive down. And the good news is most organizations, most large organizations have enough bloat on the things on the right to enable the investment thesis on the left. So if we move forward to what's really happening, and I'm going to do this really quickly. The manner in which people are accessing talent is changing. The whole thesis of Agile, we spoke about Agile distribution is pretty significant. 58% of organizations are using more Agile in the last 6 months in a post-COVID era. As they're using more Agile, they're doing it not with their established players. They are doing it with the established players also, but there's a greater tendency to use specialist suppliers, right? So 53% are doing this more with specialist suppliers. 42% are doing it with their tier 1 partners. But here's two very interesting stats, which is at the bottom of the slide. 40% companies are using more offshore resources than what they were in a pre-COVID environment. So the whole thesis of distributed Agile, our data has shown over the last 6 months has really changed. And that's been a great, again, it's a great value enabler for savings. And then interestingly, the use of contingent labor is the only thing where you see that the gray outweighs the blue, which is people are trying to do this with lesser contingent labor, which also has implications for how you manage the on-site talent, right? So while people are doing this, all of these theses allow you to actually save money while you're transforming the talent base. As we move to the economics portion of how you price for this, there's a lot of debate about, hey, how do you really price and contract for Agile development? And the reality is that there's no one single answer. You use multiple vehicles to do that. And again, our research confirmed this. So in most organizations, by the way, you see, so 80% of organizations use 3 or more ways to price for outsourced Agile development versus relying on just one component, which actually makes a lot of sense because within your IT estate, different business units are at different levels of maturity. The low maturity ones want more of a time and material approach, which allows them to have more control. The more mature ones can actually move to a per output model quicker. But the headline here is, as you're thinking about leveraging distributed agile in your estate, don't try a one size fits all approach. It depends on your maturity function. You know, if someone wants another debrief session on how you do this successfully, we've spent a lot of time examining this, so happy to talk through this as well.
Jamit, you know, when I saw the data on this one, I was like, wow, we've made our life complicated. You know, and I think you gave a partial answer to that, is it depends. But that was my first reaction here, and a couple of those in the middle seem pretty difficult to implement.
Yeah, no, I think it's spot on, but the reality is that, you know, even within the same organization, you cannot have two teams align on the definition of a story point, right? So if you really want to do a per story point based pricing model, you need to have some great history, great definitions. And we are like, don't bother. Start with something simple, scale it, capture the value, and then try to standardize. Which is why standardizing and getting to a true consistent approach on Agile immediately, potentially a bad outcome. So as we move forward, right? Again, you know, the third message that I've spoken about from a applications perspective was this whole thesis of managed services, and how more and more organizations, we've actually seen an explosion in the number of IT departments issuing RFPs to push their AMS, production support environments, to a managed service construct while they rationalize the provider base. And I think most of y'all will understand what really is happening from a model perspective, why you move to managed service. So I kind of wanted to focus on the outcomes that we are seeing here, which I think are really interesting. So there's a lot of fragmentation in the supply base. So in this particular client that we were helping, 80 plus suppliers moved to 2. On a run rate saving perspective, over a 5-year period, there was a 50% savings on their baseline for AMS, with year one savings of more than 25%, with a committed innovation budget. And I saw there was another question about, hey, how do you really get this innovation funded? You know, in a lot of cases, the market right now is driving financial engineering to give these savings across to their clients, right? So I think that to me is a pretty interesting thesis. And then I'd say that the last couple of points that I wanted to touch upon from an operating model perspective is the performance metrics and the performance measures. So if you move to the next page, what we are truly seeing here is that there's a lot of metrics that people need to be focused on. Don't do all of them. This is a menu, right? Choose what's relevant for your context. What we've provided here is, on the left-hand side, the standard metrics related to efficiency, efficacy, timeliness, right? Most organizations are good at tracking some of the things that you see on the top left of your chart. In the box below, you see if there's a number that don't get tracked. And that's where, if you think about value for business, these metrics start to become important. The application development on time in full, we think that's an interesting one, which really creates value for the business. But where we think there's really tremendous scope to unlock business impact is when you think about the issues on the right, which is the experience level agreement and the business IT KPIs, which is still fairly early on in the journey. But this is not something you just do in your contact center, in your service desk. We're also seeing this become really important in the AMS estate, and clients who do this get to see the value in terms of improved business results, right? So metrics and performance was an issue, so we've unpacked that a bit here. And then finally, who are the suppliers that help you kind of get to that estate as you're trying to do some of these managed service ecosystems? So y'all are familiar with our peak matrices, and if you move to the, so, you know, we've been examining who some of the leading providers are when you think of some of these new ways of working, be it cloud native, be it DevOps. And what's interesting is that there's some common suppliers who are market leaders across the stack, and you'll see that there's a lot of common known names here: Accenture, Cognizant, Infosys, TCS, Wipro. What's also been very interesting to observe is that the mid-sized players have actually done really well during the COVID period, right? We're just looking at some data here in terms of winners, losers, and it's not essentially the larger ones that outshine. It's actually the some of the names that you see on the lower right-hand side of your screen, which have really done well. So it's not just a tier one market, and that's the point that we wanted to make sure you take away as you go down the operating model transformation for your applications estate.
Yeah, I mean, Jimmy, when we were looking at that data earlier, some of the ones on the bottom there were actually seeing positive revenue growth in the last two quarters in the COVID, and some of the ones on the top were actually seeing negative revenue growth. So it's interesting to track that, and we're going to put out some more content on that over time. All right, so let's move to the last chapter here. Ashwin, I want you to bring us home with the digital workplace.
Sure, Michael. And in the interest of time, I'll give high-level messages and a preview, and I will be happy to discuss this offline as well. But if you really think about digital workplace, it's been talk of the town ever since we've been going to a model which has had work from home. So the key operating model theme here is that it's going to be a hybrid model where people are going to continue working from home. It's not going to be 100% remote, but it's not going to be 100% back to offices either. It's going to be a hybrid environment. And what we have currently, what we're using currently is what we call as the current break-fix model, where all we have done is we've taken desktops, we have taken laptops, shifted it to people from a remote to help people work in a remote location, and then helped with VPN connections and what. But clearly, this is not going to sustain in the long run. And as we think of the operating model of the future for workplace, it has to be designed beyond having employees functional to having employees engage and grow, right, as part of organizations. So the shift needs to happen. It's not about having the enterprise running. It's about having each an employee growing as part of the organization. That's going to have technology implications. You need to think of productivity tools. You need to think of employee engagement tools. It's actually going to go beyond the IT mandate. You need to have the HR involved. You need to have the facilities involved. So there are a lot of different considerations that are also already coming into the picture as we think of the workplace model of the future. Now, we've been talking about the AND function for quite some time now, and I just want to quickly touch upon how this is playing out from a workplace perspective. So if you see on the next slide, right, what we have been seeing is that cost and user experience have been dual objectives in some sense that the workplace functions have been trying to run. And in best-in-class enterprises, we have actually seen this transpire as well. And the key has been coordination. We talked about innovation silos, but if you look at the TARs on the left-hand side, one of the key aspects has been that when all of these come together with a coherent mandate, with user experience and cost effectiveness at the center of it, this has been achieved. I'll just spend a minute to talk about some of the key cost reduction levers that we have seen, because that's a question that's coming up time and again. Where we see a lot of cost bloating in the workplace side is one, we see a proliferated vendor landscape, especially on the field support side of things, where we have a lot of in-country support contractors, not a lot of standardization happening over there. We see consolidation opportunities over there. The second part of it is the device and license proliferation in itself. We see over-provisioned licenses. Interestingly, we see a lot of devices which are way beyond the asset refresh cycle and are ending up in a higher TCO because the cost to manage them is going up significantly. And then obviously the right push around automation. So it's not about stifling channels, but it's the right design of interfaces and careful push of automation that is saving significant effort, right? So those would be some of the key cost saving levers that we are definitely seeing. And by the way, many of what I mentioned also help in user experience enrichment as well. Now, as we're having these conversations, especially over the last 1 to 1.5 years, the concept of XLAs that Jimit mentioned has become quite prominent. And as we'll see on the next slide, we hear a lot of enterprise queries around. So the questions have been that we understand the concept of XLAs, but we do not know how to adopt them, right? And we'll and a quick couple of lessons that we have learned that we'd like to share. One, it's about identifying the right composite set of matrices, and what we have listed over here are some examples. The second is to track and enable progress along all of these. All the different service stars that I mentioned previously need to come together, right? So the service desk alone cannot run this mandate. The desktop engineering team alone cannot run this mandate. All of them need to come together so that there's this straight through processing value that I talked about. Only then can all of the progression along some of the indices and the dimensions that we're talking about here is truly possible. And while doing that, you need to apply a phased approach. We have seen examples where clients have said that we have had 1,000 end user analytics licenses taken up, but we are not seeing the ROI. The reason is you need to start with high impact personas. It's not an easy journey. You need to try and test it out and then only scale, right? So there's a journey, it requires a phased approach, and we have seen the choice of right personas really help accelerate some of these journeys. And then finally, Jim has commented upon what's happening on the service provider landscape on the app side. If you really think of it from the workplace perspective, we definitely have seen a change in guard, right? So till 5 years back, a lot of what was happening in terms of the service provider landscape was primarily driven by the device stack and the technology stack. Now we are moving into a market where service innovation is defining success for service providers, right? So we're truly moving into the digital workplace arena, where it is about service integration, it's about implementation of technologies, it's about building transformation roadmaps anchored to user experience. It's not a device-centric, technology-centric landscape anymore. And it'll be interesting to see how this landscape further evolves as we move into a connected workplace ecosystem, where the physical and digital divide in the workplace itself starts blurring even more. So just sharing some high-level views here. Now I'll pass this on to Jimit to summarize, and then we'll take questions quickly.
Yeah, I think Ashwin, a lot of change in the landscape for sure. At a headline level, going back to Douglas Adams, don't panic. But here's some summary guidelines that we would want to share, right? Just to wrap up. Embrace the and. You have to see these as a function where you can get everything together versus having to make trade-offs. As you're designing the vision, make sure that stakeholder experiences are at the front and center of IT transformation. Centralization is key if you want to break silos, and then you need the right governance and accountability to make that happen. Do not ignore the talent base, right? In fact, our offer today was to help you kind of understand how you build a talent model, skills model of the future, because that's what's going to define the true success. And then don't retain previous metrics and measures to evaluate the problems of tomorrow. So evolve your performance management beyond just reactive metrics, right? So there's a few things we wanted you to take away. I'd say these are the top 5 that we want to leave you behind with. Michael, back to you.
Yeah, Jimit, I was just reflecting on that chart back on the peak matrix. If you look at that real quick here, 4 of the top 7 that were in 2015 are no longer in the leaders quadrant up on the right in 2020. It's an amazing movement, and those are big companies that were up there before, and you see they've moved, either don't exist anymore or have moved significantly from the upper right to somewhere else. So it's a fast moving space, and that's when we talk about new players coming onto the map, and that's a really important thing to pay attention to. So okay, so let's bring this to close here. We got some questions. Just got a couple minutes here. One of the questions I liked here is kind of almost a loaded question, and it starts out with the conversation of commoditized skills like RPA, automation testing, and I just want to stop right there. And the fact that people are now saying RPA, which was barely even in existence 2 or 3 years ago, as now people are actually referring to it as a commoditized skill. That's an amazing speed of a talent life cycle. Anyway, the question was, those have stabilized demands, whereas specific skills like cloud services, full stack development, SDN, NFV, seeing high market demand. Do you see a sizable market for cloud governance platform services in the future for CCO and CXM industry?
So I'll take that. So short answer is yes, we are seeing a lot of demand for new network capabilities. So we spoke about 5G, SD and NFV, I would argue, are probably in our middle column, right? So we are definitely seeing this happen, and it won't be true just for the CCO or CXM industry. We see this as something that impacts the broader IT space.
Okay, another question here, just on the future. In the future IT model, do you see any change in the pricing model, moving from T&M to or FP to any other model?
Yeah, I think this comes and goes in waves, right? So, and the answer varies depending on which part of the stack you're looking for. So let's take applications. I think maintenance is moving very clearly in the direction of managed service, right? Development went from T&M to fixed price back to T&M because people were tired of paying the risk premiums. Now we're kind of seeing an inverse where people want to do more per pod or per outcome. So we think that there's going to be a two-branch tree where the mature players are going to move more towards a per outcome basis, and the less mature ones are going to do an adapted form of T&M, which is the per pod pricing model. So long way to say it depends, but the general direction is to move away from capacity models to output models.
Yeah, and some of this is, being the guy with 3+ decades here, it's kind of a back to the future kind of conversation. So in the outsourcing world of, pre-2000, pre-labor arbitrage, almost everything in the industry was priced on a per output basis. So it was a per claim, per checking account, per airline ticket processed, and the applications and the infrastructure came with the service or the output. I do see as as a service trend, allowing us to move back to more of a, what are you buying? And it's not the application development or maintenance, it's the actual service itself. And so I see that coming into play as well, which is not a direct change in the T&M model. It's just a change in the services we buy. So it has an indirect implication on pricing. So, all right. So we always want to end on time. If you have questions, we will try to answer the ones that we did not get to. There's quite a few of those. You can always send an email to myself or Jamit or Ashwin. And then I would just want to point to our information that's available on the web. Certainly, we have a robust website. We have blogs out there, several that you can check up on, and then also additional content that's available to us. Feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to help you with anything that makes sense that you might need. So we thank you for your time today, and Ashwin and Jamit, have a great day, and we look forward to talking to you.